Okay, so my name is Jack, and this is my PowerPoint on the respiratory system. So, start off with the structure of what goes through the system. So it starts with the nasal cavity. That's basically nose. So when we breathe in, so air enters through our mouth and nostrils, and that's basically how we get the four types of air, which is oxygen, carbon dioxide, nitrogen, and argon in our system. Then we move on to cilia, which is in the nasal cavity. They're small hair-like follicles that are in the roof of your nostrils. Their purpose is to filter out dust particles and foreign particles out of air that you may have breathed in, and for anything from getting inside you. The nostrils are also lined with mucus, which helps with the filtration process. Moving on to the pharynx. The role of the pharynx simply is to link the nasal cavity to the mouth and with the larynx. So the epiglottis is the flap of cartilage at the top of the larynx, and it covers the esophagus when you're breathing and the trachea when swallowing. This ensures that food and air doesn't cross over, so air doesn't go down the food pipe and food doesn't go down the air pipe. Moving on to the larynx, this is known as the voice box. It helps to guide air and food down the correct channels and also projects our voice. And it's made of a cartilage, and it has a protruding section out of it called the Adam's apple, which is commonly noticed in males. Moving on to the trachea, it's also known as the windpipe, and it splits into two bronchi and contains C rings made out of cartilage to help support and keep a clear airway, so prevent anything from getting stuck into it, or to maybe prevent the shape of it from collapsing. Moving on to the bronchus, it splits off from the trachea and it guides air into each lungs. And by now, from the cilia, the air should have been purified, so no foreign particles or bad substances should have gone down into your bronchus. Moving on to bronchioles, this branches from the bronchus, and these then branch out into the alveoli. There are three main branches in the bronchioles in the right lung, and there's two main branches in the left lung. So finally, moving on to the alveoli, they're small grape-like air sacs where diffusion takes place. I'll talk about diffusion later on in the PowerPoint. And we have over 300 million of these in our lungs, allowing for sufficient amounts of gaseous exchange to take place in the lungs. So moving on to slide 2, talk about the lobes. So in the right lung there's 3 lobes, and in the left lung there's 2 lobes. The only reason there's 2 lobes in the left lung is to accommodate for the heart, because that's with the cardiac notch helps with it. And if one section of the lobe were to get infected, so say if the middle lobe here were to get infected, we still have the 2 extra lobes to support the lungs. So instead of taking out the whole lung, we don't have to take out a section of the lobe, and we still have 2 more to spare. Moving on to the pleural membrane. The lungs are surrounded by the membranes, which are pleural membranes, or the pleura, if you want to say it like that. And in it contains the pleural cavity and pleural fluid. The job of the pleural membrane is to prevent friction between the lungs and to give the lungs their shape and keep them airtight. Preventing friction will prevent them from rubbing, obviously, and it also allows them to glide over each other easily. The pleural fluid is the lubricating fluid that allows the lungs to slide over each other with ease. And the pleural cavity is the space between the 2 membranes where the pleural fluid is stored. Moving on to the visceral pleura, that's the inner pleura of the 2 pleural membranes, and it covers the surface of the lungs and it helps protection. And with the parietal pleura, that's the outer section of the pleura, of the 2 pleural membranes, and it covers the surface of the lung as well, making it protection too. Also, because I haven't put it on here, talk about the thoracic cavity. That's the chamber of the chest that gives protection to the thoracic wall. So everything in your chest section is the thoracic cavity, and everything in there which protects the respiratory organs. So respiration. What is respiration? Respiration is breathing in oxygen and breathing out carbon dioxide, or CO2 if you want to breathe it. Abbreviate it. 21% of oxygen that we breathe in is air, and approximately 0.03% of CO2 of air is what we breathe in. And when we breathe in, cilia is picking up any bacteria or foreign particles that you might inhale, like epidemium. Moving on to diffusion. Diffusion is the process of where oxygen can transport from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. So, also capillaries run very close together, alveoli as well, making diffusion possible in the lungs. So in this case, you could say that oxygen and carbon dioxide get swapped at the site of alveoli. So when we breathe in, oxygen transports to the alveoli, allowing for blood to take it in and out of the alveoli through diffusion. When we breathe out, after the oxygenated blood has dropped on any CO2, we breathe that said CO2 out of it. This is why we breathe out more CO2 than we breathe it in, as we're taking out any CO2 that we've had in our body and breathing it out through the lungs. Partial pressure would also come into consideration, as depending on tidal volume of the client, may result in a higher or lower partial pressure. So if someone has a higher tidal volume, they'd be breathing in or out more. I mean, breathing in more air or breathing out more air, that means they would breathe out more carbon dioxide or breathe in more oxygen. So moving on to the respiratory functions. The main function of the respiratory system is transport. So there are four ways of transport is through oxygen, which is carried via the arteries and arterioles to the working muscles. CO2, which is a waste product that needs to be removed from the body and is carried to the lungs via veins to be allowed to be breathed out. Hemoglobin is a protein with high affinity for oxygen. It's known as the oxygen transporting aspect of red blood cells. And oxyhemoglobin. So hemoglobin, this is what hemoglobin is known as when oxygen is bound to it, as it has a high affinity for it, and it helps to carry oxygen to the body's tissues. Moving on to lung volume. Lung volume is how much air you take in at any given time, and it differentiates from person to person. Tidal volume comes in consideration here too, as depending on if you take short breaths or long breaths. While exercising, it can mean you have either good lung volume and lung capacity. So if you have long and slow breaths, you might have high tidal volume, and if you have short and quick breaths, you might not have as good as tidal volume, depending on what athlete you are. The vital capacity of each individual varies on their lung volume too. So for example, a marathon runner would probably want to have a long and slow breaths, as they're constantly taking in on board oxygen and dispersing CO2 throughout the marathon. So there's two types of breathing control. The first one is chemical control. This is controlled by the chemoreceptors, which detect changing chemicals in blood and muscles. If CO2 levels increase, breathing rate will increase to allow for more oxygen to be inhaled and more CO2 to be exhaled, allowing for quicker dispersion of CO2 out of the body. Neurocontrol. There's two types of neurocontrol, which one is voluntary and one is involuntary. And that's controlled by the nervous system. Voluntary is when you think about breathing, so the impulses to breathing voluntarily come from the cerebral cortex in the brain. And the involuntary side is the opposite of the voluntary side, so it's when you don't think about how you breathe. And the impulses to breathing involuntarily come from the medulla oblongata in the brainstem. So mechanisms of breathing, the key muscles involved in breathing are the internal intercostal muscles, the external intercostal muscles, and the diaphragm. So, at rest, for inhalation, your diaphragm contracts and moves downwards, and the external intercostal muscles contract and internal intercostal muscles relax too. So the size of the thoracic cavity increases and forces air into the lungs, and the diaphragm also contracts. So at rest, when you exhale, the diaphragm relaxes and returns to its natural position. The external intercostal muscles also relax, and the ribs and sternum put pressure onto the lungs, which forces air out of the lungs in the end. And during exercise, during inhalation, the thoracic cavity needs to increase further. So other muscles such as the pectorals and traps help to raise the ribcage to allow more air inside the lungs. And it also enables the thoracic cavity to expand past normal resting value of 500 milliliters, which is half a litre. And during exercise, when you exhale, the internal intercostal muscles will now contract to pull the ribcage up, and also abs assist the intercostal muscles at the same time, and it also forces air out of the lungs. That was it. Any questions? I hope not.